So as Eric said, I'm Dr. Ellen Selkie, and I am an adolescent medicine fellow, and I wanted to give you all a quick overview about cyberbullying before we get into legal and school aspects of this phenomenon. So I'd like to start with a case, and this is based on a patient that I saw in my own adolescent medicine clinic. So she's a 15-year-old female and has a past medical history of obesity, juvenile arthritis, and acne, and she came to me for evaluation of depression and also had not been taking her chronic medications. And she reported over the last year that she had been bullied at school, with students calling her names and throwing food in the hallways, and then also texting her hurtful messages and telling her that she should kill herself. And so because of this, she had stayed home from school for the last 6 months prior to the visit to avoid the students, but they continued to send those messages on Facebook and text message. And over the last couple of weeks prior to the visit, she had been sleeping poorly, had depressed mood, and some suicidal ideation. And she does have some friends from school who she stays in touch with over social media, but she had become less interested in being social with them and doing activities with them. So this is a patient whose story is similar to many that we've seen in the media and also in our practices. And so I'd like to have you continue to think about this case throughout the whole panel. Thinking about cyberbullying as a sort of new phenomenon, it's been over the last 5 to 10 years that we've seen increasing attention to cyberbullying among researchers and also in the media. So in the United States, it's estimated that between 20 and 40% of middle and high school students experience cyberbullying, and it also continues into young adulthood, with studies showing a prevalence of around 10 to 15% in college students. And researchers have looked at different risk factors for victimization and perpetration of cyberbullying, as listed here. You can see there's a lot of overlapping characteristics. Often there's a lot of overlap with traditional or face-to-face bullying, and also a lot of people who perpetrate cyberbullying have been victims of it themselves. So there's some thought that there's a retaliatory element to it. So I put up this slide to illustrate the wide variance in prevalence estimates of cyberbullying victimization in research studies, and this is national and international studies. This chart was put together by the Cyberbullying Research Center. And so you can see that the average prevalence of cyberbullying victimization is estimated around 20%, but the range is somewhere between 7 and 72%, depending on how you ask. And similarly, this shows the cyberbullying offending rates. So you can see again that there's an average of around 15% of adolescents who perpetrate cyberbullying, but there's a large variance in what that number actually is. And so why is this? Let's talk about what we mean when we say cyberbullying. So in fact, it can be confusing. There's no standard definition for the term cyberbullying, and it's sometimes referred to as electronic harassment or online aggression. And some people think these are the same thing. Some people feel that they're different. And I just put up a small sampling of the ways that researchers, when they ask about prevalence rates, define cyberbullying. So it can be very broad, saying anything that someone does that is upsetting or offensive, or it can be very specific, such as the last one, where it's any behavior through electronic or digital media by individuals or groups that repeatedly communicates hostile or aggressive messages intended to inflict harm or discomfort on others. So you can see how we have a wide variance in our prevalence of cyberbullying because we don't have a good standard definition of it. So thinking about backing up and talking about the phenomenon of bullying as a whole, the CDC has in the past year developed a uniform definition of bullying, which is bullying is any unwanted aggressive behaviors by another youth or group of youth that involves observed or perceived power imbalance and is repeated multiple times or is highly likely to be repeated. Bullying may inflict harm or distress on the targeted youth, including physical, psychological, social, or educational harm. And what I'd like to do is break down this definition and talk about how it does and does not apply to cyberbullying because of the nature of online communications. So unwanted aggressive behavior. So you think this is fairly straightforward, but in digital communication it can be confusing. So it can be less clear whether a behavior is aggressive or unwanted. And that's because you don't have this face-to-face feedback that the two parties involved in the interaction are having. And so, for example, someone could comment on a photo and they think that they're being funny or nice or friendly, but the person who receives it isn't able to respond to them to show that they actually find that to be hurtful. The next part would be the observed or perceived power imbalance. So some people would argue that being online represents no power imbalance because everybody is on the internet, everyone is on the same social media, and it's an equal playing field. But on the other hand, power imbalance can also represent an imbalance of the power of information. So for example, publicly revealing a secret about a friend in order to hurt them. Or the whole concept of anonymity may represent a power imbalance. For example, the person who's experiencing cyberbullying may be powerless to stop things that are posted or disseminated anonymously, but publicly. And then there's the idea of repetition. There's debate about whether cyberbullying has to be repeated multiple times to qualify as bullying. The permanency of online interactions makes the idea of repetition more complex, since a single interaction can be viewed multiple times. Sorry, I don't know what's going on with the mic here. But regardless, I hope I've impressed on you the complexity of cyberbullying within the realm of bullying as a larger phenomenon, but we know that we're concerned about it because bullying has the potential to inflict harm on targeted youth. So I want to talk a little bit about that before I turn it over to our next presenter. So, multiple studies have found relationships between cyberbullying and depression, substance use and suicidality, and the picture is a very famous media case of Amanda Todd, who was a girl who posted on YouTube about the ways that she had been cyberbullied and later, unfortunately, committed suicide. So the relationship between cyberbullying and suicide in particular is complex. We know there's a lot of comorbidities to cyberbullying and pre-existing depression. As in my previous slide, I talked about risk factors for becoming a victim of cyberbullying, and that includes depression, which is also a risk factor for suicide. So I think I don't want to have a takeaway that cyberbullying directly always causes all these cases, but there is. And this applies to both bullies and victims. Furthermore, the research shows that the more cyberbullying occurs, the worse the outcomes tend to be. Students who are victims of cyberbullying are more likely to experience school problems and also have school avoidance. And some of the experts have speculated that the negative effects of cyberbullying are no different than those of traditional bullying. So if we address traditional bullying, because cyberbullying is part of this larger spectrum of bullying, that it will kind of resolve. But there was a recent meta-analysis that showed that even controlling for the effect of traditional bullying, cyberbullying was related above traditional bullying to suicidal ideation. So it seems that we're seeing more evidence that cyberbullying has something a little bit more harmful potentially than other bullying behaviors. So, thinking back to our case, thinking about where we would go from here in terms of solutions, I am going to now turn it over to Peter Moreno to talk about sort of some of the legal developments that have come up in cases of cyberbullying.